Imagine you're floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's pitch black. The water around you is warm, but not from the sun. The ship you were on 12 minutes ago is already at the bottom of the sea. You have nothing but a life jacket and the men screaming around you. And then, something brushes against your leg. Nearly 900 American sailors survived the sinking of the USS Indianapolis on July 30th, 1945. But surviving the ship going down was only the beginning. What came next, 4.5 days alone in the open ocean with no rescue coming, became one of the most horrifying survival ordeals in American military history. This is what actually happened.
The USS Indianapolis was not just any ship. It was a heavy cruiser, one of the most decorated vessels in the entire United States Navy. It had carried President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It had survived kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. The men aboard her were proud of that. By the summer of 1945, the crew was made up of roughly 1,196 sailors and officers. Most of them were young, teenagers and men in their early 20s. Some had been on the ship for years. Others had just reported for duty. They came from small towns, big cities, farms, and factory neighborhoods all across America. For most of them, this was simply a job they had signed up to do for their country. Among them was a young Marine named Edgar Harrell from Kentucky. He was 20 years old. His faith was strong, his character was steady. There was also Giles McCoy, another Marine, known for his toughness and shark instincts. These were ordinary young men doing what millions of Americans were doing at that time, serving in a war they believed in. In late July 1945, the USS Indianapolis completed one of the most secret missions of the entire war. It had delivered critical components of the atomic bomb, later dropped on Hiroshima, to the island of Tinian. The crew didn't even know what they were carrying. The mission was done. Now they were heading to the Philippines for training exercises. Routine. Normal. Just another leg of the journey. Nobody on that ship had any reason to believe they wouldn't make it.
It was just after midnight on July 30th, 1945. Most of the crew was asleep. The Indianapolis was moving through the Philippine Sea without a destroyer escort, a decision that would later be heavily scrutinized. The sea was dark. The ship was unprotected. At 12:14 in the morning, Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 2 of them hit. The first torpedo tore into the bow. The second struck near the center of the ship, hitting fuel tanks and a powder magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. Fire shot up through the front of the ship almost instantly. Men who were sleeping below deck were killed before they even woke up. The ship began listing, tilting hard almost immediately. Within 12 minutes, the USS Indianapolis was gone. She rolled over and slipped beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, taking hundreds of men with her. Approximately 900 sailors made it into the water. Some had life jackets, some didn't. Some grabbed whatever they could find: wooden floats, cargo nets, debris. The sea around them was covered in oil from the ship's ruptured fuel tanks. Men were choking, men were burning, men were screaming in every direction, and nobody on land knew any of it had happened. No confirmed distress signal was received. The Indianapolis had simply vanished, and because of failures in communication and reporting procedures, no one was checking for her. When you are suddenly in the open ocean in the middle of the night, with no ship, no rescue, and no timeline, every decision you make either spends your energy or saves it. The men who survived made specific choices, consciously or instinctively, that kept them alive longer than those who didn't. The first critical decision was grouping together. Survivors who found each other in the darkness began forming clusters, holding on to each other, keeping the group tight. This mattered for two reasons. It made them slightly more visible from the air, and it gave people a reason to keep going when the individual will started to break down. The second decision was staying as still as possible in the water. Movement burns energy. Movement also attracts sharks. The men who thrashed, panicked, and swam around aimlessly exhausted themselves far faster. The ones who floated, who controlled their breathing and conserved what little strength they had, lasted longer. Edgar Harrell, in his own account of the events, has spoken about the role of mental and spiritual discipline. He prayed. He focused on staying conscious, staying calm, and staying present. That kind of mental control, deliberately refusing to give in to panic, is documented across survival scenarios as one of the most important factors in who lives and who doesn't. The men also helped each other stay awake during the nights, which were the most dangerous periods. Exhaustion pulls you under, literally. Keeping the men around you alert was an act of survival for everyone. Here is where the story gets harder to talk about, because some of what happened wasn't just bad luck. Some of it was preventable. On the institutional side, the United States Navy failed these men in a way that is difficult to fully justify. When the Indianapolis didn't arrive at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines as scheduled, no one raised an alarm. The ship's non-arrival was simply logged and overlooked. No search was launched, no questions were asked. The Navy's own procedures at the time did not require the confirmation of a ship's arrival, a gap in protocol that cost hundreds of lives. Captain Charles McVeigh III had actually requested a destroyer escort for the journey. That request was denied. He was also not informed that another ship traveling a similar route had recently been attacked by a Japanese submarine. That information existed. It was not passed on. Among the men in the water, one of the most tragic mistakes was drinking salt water. As hours turned into days and dehydration set in, some men broke down and drank from the ocean around them. Salt water accelerates dehydration rapidly, causes kidney failure, and triggers severe hallucinations. Men who drank it deteriorated quickly, becoming confused, aggressive, delusional. Some swam away from the group, convinced they could see land or a ship that wasn't there. Most of them didn't survive. The life jackets themselves also became a problem over time. They were not designed for 4+ days of continuous use. As they waterlogged and degraded, they stopped providing adequate flotation. Men who had been staying above the surface with relative ease on the first day were fighting to keep their heads up by the third. By August 2nd, 1945, 4 days after the sinking, the survivors were in desperate shape. The original group of roughly 900 men had shrunk dramatically. Shark attacks had taken lives every single day. Exposure, dehydration, and salt poisoning had taken more. The men still alive were barely holding on. Then, almost by accident, everything changed. Navy pilot Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was on a routine patrol flight over the Philippine Sea. He was actually troubleshooting a problem with his antenna when he looked down and noticed something in the water. An oil slick. And then, men. Dozens of them. Gwynn immediately radioed back to base. His report set off a chain of events that moved fast. Lieutenant Adrian Marks was dispatched in a PBY Catalina seaplane. When Marks arrived on the scene and assessed the situation, sharks actively attacking survivors, men too weak to stay afloat, he made a decision that technically went against his orders. He landed the aircraft on the open ocean, in rough water, in a shark-infested area. He was not supposed to do that. He did it anyway. Marks and his crew began pulling men out of the water by hand. They stuffed survivors into every inch of the aircraft. When the inside was full, they tied men to the wings with parachute cord to get them out of the water. He stayed there until surface ships arrived. That decision, one pilot choosing to break protocol because the right thing was obvious, saved lives that would have been lost in the time it took for ships to arrive. The surface rescue operation that followed involved multiple ships arriving through August 2nd and 3rd. Survivors were pulled from the water in desperate condition. Many were covered in oil. Severe saltwater ulcers had eaten into their skin. Dehydration had left some barely conscious.
Shark wounds were common. Some men died even after being pulled aboard rescue vessels, their bodies simply too far gone. Of the approximately 900 men who made it off the ship and into the water, 316 survived. 579 men died during those 4.5 days in the Pacific. It remains the single largest loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy. The aftermath was painful in ways beyond the numbers. Captain Charles McFay III was court-martialed, controversially, for hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. Even Commander Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who sank the ship, testified that zigzagging would not have changed the outcome. McVeigh was convicted anyway. He received hate mail from the American public for the rest of his life. In 1968, he took his own life. In 2000, the United States Congress passed a resolution formally stating that McVeigh's record should reflect that he was exonerated. It was decades too late. The survivors, men like Edgar Harrell and Giles McCoy, spent the rest of their lives carrying what happened. Harrell wrote a book about it. McCoy advocated for McVeigh's exoneration until his own death. These men never forgot, and they made sure history didn't either. Every survival story, real ones especially, leaves something behind worth understanding. The Indianapolis gives us several. The first lesson is that panic kills faster than the threat itself. The men who survived those 4.5 days were not necessarily the strongest or the fittest. They were often the ones who managed to stay calm, stay focused, and make deliberate choices when everything around them was chaos. The second lesson is that grouping together matters. Isolation in a survival situation, physical or psychological, accelerates deterioration. The men who stayed with others, who kept each other awake and accountable, lasted longer. The third lesson is that desperation leads to bad decisions. Drinking salt water felt like relief. It was a death sentence. In survival situations, the worst choices often feel logical in the moment. Slowing down, even briefly, before acting on desperation can change the outcome. The fourth lesson is institutional. Communication systems, reporting protocols, and accountability structures exist for a reason. When those systems fail, when a ship goes missing and nobody checks, people die who didn't have to. The Indianapolis disaster directly changed how the Navy tracked and confirmed the movements of its vessels. And the final lesson is simpler than all the others. It's about the human decision to keep going. Edgar Harrell has said that he chose, consciously, to survive 1 hour at a time, not 4 days, 1 hour. That kind of deliberate, narrow focus, refusing to think about the whole impossible situation and just handling the next hour, is something that shows up in survivor accounts across every type of survival scenario ever documented. The men of the USS Indianapolis were not superhuman. They were young Americans from ordinary places who found themselves in an unimaginable situation. The ones who made it home did so through discipline, through each other, and through a decision made over and over again not to quit. Remember their names, remember what they endured, and remember that the line between survival and loss is often not strength. It's the choices made in the moments when giving up feels easier. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. That tells me you actually care about real stories that matter. If this hit you the way it hit me while researching it, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. And if you want more real survival stories like this one, subscribe. I drop new videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.